will secure the future. You'll have the chance to ask me any question you have about this election, and particularly any question about Canada's recovery plan, our plan to get the economy back on track. If you have a question for me, please press *3 now. Or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, use the comments to ask your question. I want to be very clear. Having an election right now is quite frankly reckless. Rather than focusing on an election, the Prime Minister should be thinking about how to work with all provinces to meet the threat of a Delta-driven fourth wave, how to tackle fires, how to secure the recovery of small businesses, and how to handle the tragic situation in Afghanistan. He's also made the cost of living crisis and housing crisis worse over the last few years and has presented no plan. After years of over-promising and under-delivering for Atlantic Canada, Mr. Trudeau now thinks that you should reward him with a majority. There may be 4 parties on the ballot in the coming election, but there's only 2 choices. Canada's Conservatives with a plan for our future, or more of the same. Together with the Liberals and the NDP, they have an agenda of more borrowing and debt, higher taxes, and rising prices, gas, groceries, housing, and essentials. But Canada's Conservatives will stand up for hardworking Canadians and their families. We'll fight the cost of living crisis. And that's why we're running on Canada's recovery plan. It's a plan to get Canada's economy firing on all cylinders. It's our plan to secure 1 million jobs in the next year, those we lost in the pandemic and more. We're going to introduce tough new anti-corruption laws to clean up the mess in Ottawa. We're going to show mental health leadership by implementing our Canada Mental Health Action Plan to help people, particularly coming out of the pandemic. We're going to build up capacity in our country to be ready for future pandemics and threats. And finally, we're going to balance the federal budget over the course of the next decade because it's wrong to shoulder Mr. Trudeau's debt on the shoulders of our children and grandchildren. Canada's Conservatives will secure the future for communities across Atlantic Canada and across Canada. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and talking about our plan. Remember, hit *3 now if you have a question or comment below if you're watching on Facebook. Final thing, we're talking to all the Atlantic provinces tonight. I'm an honorary Nova Scotian, moving there when I served in the Canadian Armed Forces at Shearwater, met my wife Rebecca from Fall River, and of course sailed on HMCS St. John's. I got to stand on Hibernia when our Sea King helicopter landed there. And with Gage down in New Brunswick and my time as Veterans Affairs Minister headquartered out of Charlottetown, I've had time to connect with so many Atlantic Canadians directly. We want you to know that Canada's Conservatives are going to fight for an economic recovery in all sectors of our economy and in all regions of this great country. Mr. Trudeau has taken Atlantic Canada for granted, and it's time to stop that. My wingman tonight here, not on Sea Kings, but here in the Conservative studio, is a great friend, great MP, Michael Barrett, our candidate in Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes. Take it away, Michael.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today, Erin. I'm going to be your moderator tonight, folks. It's a pleasure to join you virtually in Atlantic Canada. And I'm so excited to be running under the Canada's Recovery Plan with our leader, Erin O'Toole. Our team is ready across the country, and you know, with a leader like Erin, who was raised in the working community of Bowmanville, Ontario, middle-class family, hard work, and the values of helping your neighbor, we couldn't be better positioned. Before his career in politics, as Erin mentioned, he served our country in the Royal Canadian Air Force for 12 years, sailed with our Atlantic Navy, and is the only member of the House of Commons to have stood on Hibernia, the Hibernia platform. Erin stands up for hardworking Canadians. He wants to work for you, and as a parent of 2, he wants to make sure that for generations to come, Canadians can grow up with world-class services such as healthcare, a thriving economy, and secure finances. So the telephone town hall is about to start. As Erin said, press *3 to ask him your question. And if you're watching online, on Facebook or YouTube, please leave us a comment and we'll get to that. So if you have a question for Erin O'Toole, press *3 now or comment below if you're watching on Facebook. So our first question comes from Sheila Scott. She's in Whitetown, New Brunswick, and Sheila's question is about healthcare. Sheila, you are live now with Erin O'Toole. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Sheila.
Hi, I'm from Boys Town, New Brunswick. The girl misunderstood.
Okay, Boys Town. Nice to have you on the line tonight.
And, nice to speak with you. We do support you. Just wondering what you're going to do about health care, or what can be done about health care. Here in New Brunswick, we have a shortage of doctors and nurses. The doctors and nurses are not getting paid enough to keep them here or come here. Our ERs are shut down a lot of weekends now, and even some evenings through the week, because there's not enough doctors and nurses to staff. So our health care is in crisis.
Well, thank you, Sheila. I was in Atlantic Canada in the last week of this campaign and was talking with our candidate in Fredericton, Andrea Johnson, just about this very topic, how much health care is coming up in this campaign. And in Canada's recovery plan, which we launched at the beginning of this campaign, we're making an historic investment in our public health care system. 6% minimum increase per year over the course of our time in government, a commitment that over the decade would be a commitment of $60 billion for the provinces to build up capacity on their front lines, including, as you said, some parts of Atlantic Canada are short doctors, nurses, and those that are there are burned out. The pandemic has been very, very tough, and we need to make sure that we can provide some relief, need to make sure we partner with the provinces, and that's why we're going to have a record commitment, far more, like double, actually, the commitment that Mr. Trudeau had made in the last year to the long-term funding of our health system. And we have to partner with the provinces. What's been frustrating is Mr. Trudeau calls an election in a pandemic for his own purposes, and in the last few weeks, he's tried to pick fights or poke at 2 or 3 different premiers at a time we should be working together. So we will respect the provinces making decisions and priorities. In fact, the provinces have to train and hire physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, technicians, personal support workers. So when Mr. Trudeau makes promises or recycles promises, makes the same promise he didn't deliver on several years ago, Canadians are getting cynical. We're going to partner with record level of investment, allow the provinces to build up capacity, fix gaps that were shown in the public health care system. And on top of that, Sheila, we've made commitments as part of our National Mental Health Action Plan, support for employers, incentives for them to start mental wellness programming for their employees, funds for nonprofit groups on the ground helping with mental health and wellness issues in communities across the country, and leadership on addictions and suicide prevention. So Sheila, we want the economy to be secured after this pandemic, and we want the wellness of families and communities to be secured as well.
If you have a question for Erin O'Toole, press *3 on the phone now. Our next question comes from Plen, and Plen's question is about childcare. Plen, you're live now with Erin O'Toole. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I've noticed that 7 provinces, I think it is, have signed up for this $10 a day childcare. So I want to know who's paying for it. Is federal government paying for it all?
Well, that's a great question, Glenn. And the 7 agreements signed in the last few weeks before an election intend to make the provinces pay for at least half of the program. And what was interesting when the Liberals announced this for the 9th time as a party, they didn't consult the provinces ahead of the budget. So you could see this was put forward really as something they would talk about before an election with no real plan to deliver, because even the agreements signed are for spaces 5 or 6 years from now. The Conservative plan on childcare is going to help all families immediately, because it's not going to force one model that will only help a portion of families, particularly leaving out a lot of rural and suburban families, people on shift work, people with modified work schedules. We want all families to be able to make the best decisions for them to juggle the challenges of raising children and working. Great challenges to have, because we want families to do well and work and be productive. We want to make up the losses for women that have been a big setback from the pandemic. So we need to give as much flexibility and support immediately. So we're going to help all families, and folks in the lower revenue levels will get the most help. So we're income basing this so that folks in the lower tax brackets will get up to 75% of the costs of childcare covered. So we're going to provide help to all families, flexibility immediately. Mr. Trudeau's plan is a plan that may come along for some families 5 years from now. Families need to be in the driver's seat, and they need support immediately, and they will get that with the Conservative Party.
So we're going to take more of your calls. Please press *3 if you have a question for Erin. I have a quick question for you, though. If you plan to support your Conservative candidate in the September 20th election, press 1 now. If you're going to support one of the other parties, press 2. And if you're still undecided or unsure, press 3. And now, back to your questions. We're going to go with Michael, who has a question about the pandemic response. Michael, you're live now with Erin O'Toole.
Good evening, Erin. I guess just a general question. How would you handle our current pandemic situation in Canada that would be somewhat different than the way Mr. Trudeau is handling it?
Well, thanks for the question, Michael. And first off, at a time of crisis for our country, we all have to work together, and that's what I tried to do immediately. I was running for leadership of the Conservatives, and I suspended my race, tried to help the government with ideas and suggestions. And then, of course, we supported emergency programs to get money out the door to help people, to help businesses survive, and to help ensure that our country had a response. The military person in me always says, put the needs of the country first, and that's what we need to do. The big challenge with the Trudeau Liberals is they did not learn the lessons from the first wave of the pandemic. In fact, they weren't prepared with PPE and masks. They had actually given equipment away to China at a time where there was a global rush on these resources. You would have thought they would have learned their lesson and developed capacity to make vaccines directly or under contract here in Canada. They didn't. They tried to partner again with China. That fell apart. That made us 4 months or so later than most other countries. I like to say they were lacking ambition. 100 years ago, Canada gave the world insulin. In this last year, we've had to rely on others at a time where you can't rely on others because there's a crisis. So that's why, Michael, the fourth pillar of Canada's recovery plan is securing our country's capacity in vaccines, in critical medicines. Mr. Trudeau wouldn't even meet with pharmaceutical companies over the last few years about their investments in innovation in Canada. We want to cultivate that to make sure that we're ready. The same thing goes to our pandemic warning system that Mr. Trudeau turned off, sadly, months before it was needed most. We need to be ready. We need to have the tools to respond. And in terms of a disaster response, we're going to make sure the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office has that planning there. And I think, Michael, this probably demonstrates the biggest difference between Mr. Trudeau and myself. I build teams, I set a plan, and I get things done. Mr. Trudeau's very good at announcing things and never delivering. Deficits, safe drinking water, ethical, transparent, by default government, delivering on the vaccine. We need a Prime Minister that will follow through and get things done for Canadians. And I think we have amazing capacity in this country, but we need a plan to get back on our feet, and we need leadership.
So if you have a question for Erin O'Toole, press *3 on your phone now. Our next question comes from Eleanor, and she has a question about home affordability. So Eleanor, you are going to be live in just 1 second.
Hi, Eleanor.
Hello.
There we go.
Hi. Yes, I would like to know why we are being swallowed up by Europeans and people that are not from this country and buying up our properties. I really don't believe in it. And putting people out on the streets. They put a lot of people out on the street. One woman here was on the street with no place to go because her rents went so high. And I think it's just a mean way of treating people, because actually I think if you left your dog running wild and not looking after it, you'd be fined for it. But we put people out on the street and we don't look after them. And all human beings are equal, whether we believe it or not. Some people don't, I do. And I think that we should do something about foreign ownership and stop it. And the only province that I do believe that charges extra taxation for foreign ownership is in Prince Edward Island. And they have to pay extra taxes for people coming in there and buying up property. And we end up paying the taxes for somebody's pleasure of coming to our beautiful country of the Maritimes.
Well, thank you,
we
Eleanor.
have a nice quiet life.
Well, thank you, Eleanor. Let me tell you this. The Conservative government will ban purchases of homes from foreign non-resident investors for a minimum of 2-year period. We've been calling on this for months, and just a few months ago, Mr. Trudeau rejected our idea. But as people have seen, we need real action on this after 6 years of kicking the can down the road by Mr. Trudeau, making the problem worse. He's now flip-flopping, trying to actually follow our lead. We will do this. We brought this plan to the House of Commons not long ago because it is completely unfair for people to park money in Canada as a safe place and price people out of the market. Not just young people and those first-time home buyers, empty nesters who want to downsize. People can't have the option to stay in their own community. So one key element, the housing crisis has many elements, but one is to put a stop to this. And we've said we would do that for a period of 2 years and review it then. You're right, PEI has been doing this, and I spoke about this when I was there with our candidates, Doug Curry and some of our other candidates the other day. PEI did that because waterfront, oceanfront was being bought up, and they want to make sure that people are buying homes, are working, investing, paying taxes, and being part of our communities, not parking safe money. We're also, to tackle the housing crisis, going to provide serious leadership to build 1 million new units in 3 years. We're going to free up federal lands and property holdings to accelerate supply. We're going to tie transit investment money for density to make sure that there's more building and faster supply of homes. That's what we need to see. We're going to make first-time home buyers get a little more flexibility in having longer mortgage terms and fix some of the CMHC rules. We also want to make sure that if there is foreign money that wants to invest in Canadian real estate, it should be in purpose-built rental housing. And we're going to work also with the private sector to incentivize more of that, because you're right, Eleanor, people are getting priced out of rents. There's a renting crisis as well in the country, and we'd like to see leadership there. And we want to see more action. And I agree with you. The dignity of being able to have affordable housing and to help those who are homeless is part of our mental health action plan as well. We need a compassionate way to handle addiction, and we need to work with nonprofit groups on the ground, helping those at risk, either homelessness or near homeless. I worked on these issues as veterans minister. Our National Mental Health Action Plan will also tackle this, because you're right. Everyone deserves dignity, Eleanor, and our recovery plan, doesn't want to leave anyone behind in the recovery from COVID.
So if you have a question for Erin, press *3 on the phone now. Our next question comes from James. James has a question about the economy. You can go ahead. You're live now with Erin O'Toole.
Hello.
Hi, James.
Hello, Erin. Can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm calling from Nova Scotia. I'm speaking from Nova Scotia. And I live in the Cape Breton area, and we have a very sluggish economy here in Cape Breton. And we've had a sluggish economy for the last 30 years. We have problems with our governments of all stripes, Liberals, Tories, and NDPs, who refuse to talk about an issue with equalization here in this province. It is Cape Breton and rural Nova Scotia who generates the entire transfer of over $2 billion a year, but yet we don't get it. We notice time and time again that spending is focused on downtown Halifax, who doesn't qualify for it. What will the Conservatives do to fix that?
Well, thanks, James. In fact, it was great to be back in Cape Breton just a few days ago with Eddie Orrell and Fiona McLeod, our candidates. And there's a real desire for change in Cape Breton. Cape Bretoners, whether they're still on the island or around the country when I run into them, some of the most proud folks of their roots, hardworking, and Canada's recovery plan with investments in infrastructure and particularly helping small business and the highly impacted tourism sector. We want to make sure that the economy in Cape Breton does well so that we can have jobs. I like to talk about an economic recovery in all sectors of the economy and in all regions. There's also been a lack of respect for Atlantic Canada under Mr. Trudeau. In 2015, he won all the seats, yet he's never had an Atlantic Canadian as the Minister of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. They were in Mississauga and then Montreal, so I guess he's moving east, but that was a complete sign of disrespect for an agency meant on working with startups, with entrepreneurs, with businesses that are expanding. We need to make sure that there's that respect there. We also have a super EI element that we're rolling out to make sure that when there's a downturn in terms of employment opportunities with a recession or even a downturn in a non-technical recession, we need to make sure that there's an ability to support people, support workers with a super EI, and then work on training and other opportunities to get people back to work. And in terms of ACOA and the support, we need to make sure that rural Nova Scotia and rural parts of Atlantic Canada have opportunities and not just the big cities. So I can tell you that after the pandemic, we need to see a recovery for all Canadian families. Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Singh talk about building back better by helping some sectors or some parts of the country. We need everyone to have a recovery after COVID-19, and Canada's recovery plan is our roadmap to deliver that.
So if you're just joining us, you can press *3 if you want to ask your question to Erin O'Toole. Now, if you've been listening for a little while and you're ready to participate in my question for you, you can follow along. So if you're going to vote for your Conservative candidate and Erin O'Toole, you can press 1 on your phone. If you're going to vote for one of the other parties, please press 2. And if you're undecided, please press 3. And our next question comes from Ryan. And Ryan's question, Erin, is about the environment. Ryan, you can go ahead.
Good evening, Erin. Can you hear me fine?
I can, Ryan. Go ahead, please.
All right. So I'm out here from Newfoundland, and as a younger member, as a younger citizen, I understand why the economy and employment is a more current issue and a bigger focus. But when we're looking at the long term and even decades in advance, is there any long-term plan for the environment, like climate change? Is there any worries there?
Thanks, Ryan. Yes, there are worries. We have to act on climate change. And it's important to me, and I've talked about this when I talk politics with Molly, my 15-year-old. She usually asks about the environment. And when we were preparing our platform, I actually talked to her about elements of it. And we launched it in April. And it's a plan to get emissions down, meet our Paris commitment, but to also make sure we balance off jobs and an economic recovery. As you said, the economy is important, working is important, and in the medium and longer term, we have to make smart policies to make our reduction targets without blowing up parts of our economy. Mr. Trudeau and some of his ministers, before they came to office, they talked about shutting down the oil sands, shutting down this, shutting down that. We need all cylinders in our economic engine to be firing after COVID-19. Mr. Trudeau has put on about $500 billion worth of debt, and we just saw economic numbers today that show our future is very uncertain. So we need to get the country working, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle emission reduction, climate change, inequalities, and some of the challenges we have to address as a nation. So we're tired of the hollow promises by Justin Trudeau. He'll say something and have no plan to achieve it. He has failed on his climate targets every year as Prime Minister. So when he makes up new ones with no plan, I think that's failed leadership. So we put in Canada's recovery plan a detailed plan that does everything from price carbon, get emissions down with large emitters, and then partners on renewable natural gas standard, electric vehicles, working with small modular reactors, carbon capture and sequestration. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, Ryan, some of the lowest carbon intensity oil produced by our country is in the offshore in Newfoundland and Labrador that Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Regan have done nothing for. In fact, their bills and their anti-resource rhetoric has led millions of dollars of investment away. And for some of the challenges Newfoundland and Labrador is facing, the offshore represents 25% of the economy there. Mr. Trudeau is putting the lives of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, their prosperity, at risk in the future. So we have a $1.5 billion offshore recovery fund to make sure that we can get that sector going again. It's low emission, low intensity energy. And for the next few decades, as we continue to get emissions down, as we continue to move towards a lower carbon future, we should actually be proud to use Canadian resources, which are heads and shoulders above all of the other countries that produce these types of resources. So I think the environment is very important, Ryan, and we can have a plan to get our emissions down and have a strong economy.
So our next question might explain, it has to do with an announcement that would explain why Wexford O'Toole was on the campaign trail yesterday. And
nicely played.
Thank you. So we're going to bring Bonnie on with a question about your announcement about puppies. Bonnie, you're on with Erin O'Toole.
Hi, and thank you for taking me. What I wanted to say, it has to do with mental health, especially for seniors. And I watched you talking about the importance of a pet, what they are to a home. And being a senior, if I didn't have a pet, I'd be taking medications, for depression, for whatever. But I wanted to thank you for bringing this to the attention of many people that just think a dog's a dog or a cat's a cat, and they're your property. They don't have feelings, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess basically I just wanted to say thank you for doing this and for working with the SPCAs and animal cruelty. You are the first leader or potential leader that has ever even thought about it, let alone talk about it. So on behalf of the animals and seniors that are over-medicated because of depression, I want to thank you.
Wow, thank you, Bonnie. And thank you for being honest about your own situation. Our pets are part of our family, and that's why we did have our dog Wexford with us yesterday, and the kids. And families and seniors living in a lot of isolation have seen these as godsends in a very difficult year. When I was Veterans Minister, I helped approve a service dog program, and I've seen companion animals, service animals, save lives. It's incredible. And so we have to make sure that we promote their welfare. And what we've seen in the pandemic with the rise of desire for people to get pets, there's been an increase in bad breeding, in puppy mills. We're going to go after that and shut it down. We're also going to make sure that we end cosmetic testing on animals. And in particular, we want to make sure that someone leaving violence, a woman leaving a household where there's risk, let's help as much as we can to make sure that they can take their pet with them. We know that that's one of the things that sometimes block them from leaving a violent environment. We also know how important, as you said, Bonnie, pets are to the well-being of our country. So I am a conservative. I'm very much about getting our economy going. I want to get our finances under control. But I do want to help our country and our families and people that have been isolated and that have challenges. So that's why the center pillar of our plan is mental health and wellness, something very important to our team, something very important to my wife Rebecca and I. And I want to thank you for telling your story about how important your furry family member, as we say, is to you. We need to make sure that we support one another after a very challenging year and a half for our country.
If you have a question for Erin O'Toole, you can press *3 on your phone. Now, our next question comes from Roy, and it has to do with the lobster dispute. And Roy, you can go ahead with your question for Erin now.
Thank you for taking my question. As you know, the lobster fishery is the economic engine in southwest Nova Scotia. My question is, what is your position concerning the lobster dispute in southwest Nova Scotia between commercial fishermen and First Nations? And do you believe all lobster fisheries should all fish in the same season?
Thank you for the question, Roy. And I do think there should be one season, one rule with respect to conservation of a resource, and a path to make sure that the traditional fishery and the Indigenous fishery can coexist and even partner. And we have seen that with some First Nations partnering with companies like Clearwater and others and building their own domestic fishing capacity. But the two Marshall decisions, which I know well because we learned a lot about the Marshall decisions when I went to law school at Dalhousie in Halifax. The second decision talks about the ability for the federal government and for the department to set rules with respect to preserving an important resource for both the traditional and Indigenous fishery. There is an Aboriginal right to participation in the fishery for moderate livelihood that is important and can be maintained. But we have to make sure that we preserve this resource. And for centuries, some of the small communities along shores in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada, that can be preserved as well. And this is an example of where leadership has been lacking. My first real substantive phone call with Mr. Trudeau, I raised the dispute in Nova Scotia that had been simmering for months, long before it spilled over into some violence and vandalism. Bernadette Jordan ignored this issue. So did Dominic LeBlanc, who is from the region. In fact, he was found to breach ethics rules, giving a fishery license to a family member. So rather than actually working hard to establish over several years the ability to have an Indigenous fishery alongside maintaining the strong and important traditional fishery, they didn't get it done. And when things boiled over, they appoint a retired Liberal politician to talk to people about it. That is not leadership. So we will tackle the tough issues to make sure that we have a route to Indigenous reconciliation that guarantees those rights, but preserves the traditional fishery and conserves the stocks for the long term. I want you to know that it was Chris d'Entremont, the Conservative MP, that had brought this issue to me, and Rick Perkins, our candidate in South Shore St. Margaret's, we've talked about it consistently on how we have to get the balance right here. And Ms. Jordan has been completely absent and has really failed on the file.
So if you have a question for Erin O'Toole, you can press *3 on your phone now. And if you'd like to let us know how you'll be voting in the upcoming election, if you plan to vote for your Conservative candidate and Erin O'Toole, press 1 now. If you're going to vote for one of the other parties, press 2. And if you're unsure, please press 3. So our next question comes from Gordon in Malpeque. And Gordon has a question about being able to hire folks post-pandemic. Gordon, go ahead with your question now, please.
Thank you. This is Ed Gordon from Malpeque. I've been a career banker for over 40 years. I've run into many times, but the two recent conversations I'll recite. Person that owns a hairstyling salon. It's got 3 vacant chairs, tries to hire staff, and they said, "Oh, I'll come to your work for you after my CERB runs out." Another customer today turns around and says, "Gordon, I have an annual payment due at the end of the busy tourism season," and he said, "I'm quite sure I'm going to have a struggle to make that payment." He said, "I can't get kitchen staff." He said, "There's been a couple of days recently that have been closed because I can't get cooks. Kind of hard to run a business." Same story. Well, they're on CERB, so I don't need a paycheck this week. So our next future Prime Minister, Mr. O'Toole, I'd like your comments, please.
Well, thank you, Gordon. And I was in PEI, and it was great to be with Jody Sanderson, our candidate in Malpeque. I think the retiring Liberal MP is not going to miss his time seeing so many things squandered by Mr. Trudeau, and we need to do better. And in fact, my first interview as Conservative leader, I said we needed to make sure that we provided supports, including the CERB, when people did not have the ability to work. But as the economy was rounding back up in second and third waves of this pandemic, we needed to change the programs to reflect the needs of the economy. Mr. Trudeau did not do that. And even as he was running up to this pandemic election that he was planning, he just kept kicking the can down the road. And I've heard this same story in PEI that you just described, Gordon. I went to my barber today. I don't give her much to work with, Michael, like you, but she's one of the few left. She's also a part of a military family, and she's one of the few that has come back. And this is a business that is hanging on by a thread. Restaurants can't find people. Service and other jobs, the families that run them are burnt out because they're working all the time because they can't hire people. How is that fair? How is that right? So what we need to do is transition and have a fair approach to creating jobs and opportunity, not more reliance and extension of programs. What we also need to do is help the highly impacted sectors, and you named a bunch of them. Restaurants and hospitality, travel, tourism, services like the salons, the barbers, the folks that have been hanging on through restrictions and now can't open. So we have a jobs boost. We have a rebuilt Main Street both loan program for some of those folks struggling, with some of it being forgivable, and we're going to encourage other Canadians to invest in Main Street businesses to help them survive or help create new businesses and closed up storefronts through a rebuild Main Street tax credit. We have to get this country working again, and Canada's recovery plan, our 1 million jobs in 1 year pledge, is going to get the economy surging in the right direction by helping the highly affected sectors get people back to work and ensure we have an economic recovery after COVID in all sectors of the economy and in all regions of the country.
So if you have a question for Erin O'Toole, you can press *3 on your phone now. Our next question comes from Sean. Sean is a veteran who is looking for integrity from our politicians and has a question for you, Erin. So Sean, you can go ahead. You're live now.
Yes, good day, our next Prime Minister. You being a veteran, me being a disabled vet, you already have integrity. And one of the biggest issues around our OSIS groups is the lack of integrity from Mr. Trudeau. And unfortunately, some of us actually voted on an empty promise of fixing the pension. Now, unfortunately, he never served in the military, to my knowledge, so integrity is not something he's been raised with. Yeah, you're full of integrity, and your word means something. What is your vision to fix or help the veterans going forward?
Well, first off, Sean, thank you for your service. And I'm fortunate. I did not leave serving my country with a disability, and so I was able to take my tremendous experiences and then transition into careers in the corporate world and in politics. But I never forgot the military and the people that had given me so much. And the sort of true patriot love I have, I tried to channel into helping military families, helping injured veterans. And I've met with many OSIS groups, and I think they're one of the best resources out there for people transitioning, and that sort of band of brothers, that veterans helping veterans. I find that inspiring. And trust is eroded after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau. He did lie to veterans. He marched out Harjit Sajjan and a number of people to stand around him, and he said he was going to return to the old pension, the Pension Act, something that Paul Martin had changed. He knew full well he was not going to do that. He also made commitments about veterans that were in court, the Equitas lawsuit. He knew that he wasn't going to live up to that either. When I became Veterans Minister, I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. It meant sometimes I got worse headlines. It meant sometimes that my political opponents would exploit ongoing issues like the Equitas lawsuit. But I could look at those veterans who were suing their government and always know I was telling them the truth and doing the best I could. And today they're friends of mine. And a lawsuit we had temporarily settled, Mr. Trudeau misled them and then took it back to court with the very lawyers in the government that I had removed from the file. That erodes integrity. And Mr. Trudeau, as I said, I know he respects our veterans as well, but you don't make commitments you can't keep. And we have a Prime Minister who's done that for 6 years, and we're tired of it. I hear this all the time. So I'm running on a plan that I intend to keep, because we need a plan. And for veterans, Sean, I want to particularly get wait times down. I was able to get that done as minister by putting a SWAT team in place, by having some veterans that I hired administer it. I also need to make sure that we have more mental wellness programming for veterans and their families. The most complex cases, and you would know this through your work within the OSIS sector, the most complex cases are mental wellness cases, because there often isn't one treatment option for folks with a mental injury from service. So we have to have more options, which is why we did work with service dogs, which is why we did equine therapy. We did more peer support therapy. And as part of our Canada Mental Health Action Plan, we want to make sure that there is no stigma associated with coming and getting supports and getting people on that road to wellness. It's why Romeo Dallaire and I started an event for veterans. He was a Liberal senator and I was a backbench Conservative MP, but we put the needs of our veterans and mental health discussions first. That's how I will conduct myself as Prime Minister, and I think we need integrity in our leaders.
Press *3 if you have a question for Erin O'Toole. And if you'd like to share with us how you plan to vote in the upcoming election, you can press 1 if you'll be voting for your Conservative candidate, press 2 if you're voting for one of the other parties, or press 3 if you're undecided. And our next question comes from Joanna, and Joanna has a question about the economy. Joanna, you're live. Please go ahead with your question now.
Yeah, my question is back to the person before about Canada getting back to work, and that includes economically, because people, I don't think, realize that in our food industry, between the farmers and the processors, there's a big need for extra workers. And the other thing is also with the health industry, if I call it that way, how many people are sitting home waiting for procedures and not being able to have an income because not everybody has an insurance. And I mean, no wonder the health service costs more. If they would put people to work and work it that way, I think that's a bigger benefit that they can help the economy. Myself, I'm a person that was in the health issue. I ended up from being a person that contributed to society to a person that is 95% relying on somebody else. So that is my question. And what is the Conservative government? If they get the majority of votes, what are they going to do about that?
Well, thank you, Joanna. We have a lot of things in Canada's recovery plan that I think would apply to some of the things you discussed. We want to double the disability supplement in the Canada Workers Benefit and accelerate some supports to people living and working with a disability. For those that can work, even in a modified or part-time way, they should never be at a disadvantage for working. So we're going to take some federal leadership here and partner with the provinces to make sure that there aren't clawbacks or other things that would actually disincentivize them from working. There's a purpose element to this. This is another thing I saw with veterans, and I think we can learn a lot by allowing people that ability to contribute. For people with serious illnesses like cancer, a few days ago I announced that we would extend EI to 52 weeks for people in those situations. We want people to be able to concentrate on their treatment and the wellness of their family and not be worried in these serious cases of benefits running out. We've got a system that allows that through physicians now. We can easily adapt that to a longer period for people with serious illnesses. The health backlogs that you talked about, people that are sometimes waiting for services, that has gotten worse from the pandemic, of course, because of cancellations, restrictions. We want to make sure that we build that capacity back into our system. That's why one of the elements of our plan is to make a once-in-a-generation commitment to massive increases for our public universal health care system. We're using 6% minimum in terms of increase per year to allow the provinces to deal with some of these backlogs, some of the fatigue, as I said earlier, impacting our frontline workers, and so that provinces have stable, increasing, predictable funding so that they can make decisions. Because sometimes these decisions might take 7-8 years to deliver doctors at the tail end of it. When Mr. Trudeau says for the second time in a few years he's hiring doctors, he's not actually hiring doctors. He's putting that in his press release. We need to make sure we give the supports to the provinces that they can count on that money down the road as they're building the needs for their economy. So hopefully, Joanna, that answered some of your questions. But we really want to make sure that we have a strong economy, we get people working, so that we can also make sure we can support folks with a disability and have a long-term commitment to a world-class, universal public health care system.
Our next question comes from Peter, and Peter's question is about China, our relationship with China. So Peter, you can go ahead and ask your question now. You're live.
Erin, I know you're committed to getting out of the Asia Infrastructure Bank, and you also know that one of our Michaels is now doing an 11-year term in China. What else would you do with China to try to get our two Michaels back home?
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm glad you mentioned the case of the two Michaels. You know, all Canadians, all political parties want to see them returned. It's a tragic situation, and in fact, in a couple of days, it will be 1,000 days in prison. And as you said, Mr. Spavor has already had a sort of a sham judicial process. There is no legal justice system in China. It is manufactured by the communist state and its apparatus. So what we need to do is to stand up in a more serious way with respect to bad conduct by the Communist Party. Using sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, against certain leaders within that communist structure would be a clear sign that this type of diplomatic hostage-taking is not condoned. So if a country really wants to emerge as the superpower that China is and likes to profess itself to be, it needs to conduct itself in a way that is fulfilling the sort of values and commitments to law that is worthy of a country of that stature. And I think our allies are desperate to see a more Canada back on the world stage. It's been actually since the Obama administration that they've been wanting to take Chinese trade practices more seriously. We're the only country of our closest allies, the Five Eyes, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, that has not yet banned Huawei from our 5G infrastructure. That's wrong, and we should. It's been something I've been saying for 5 years. When we talked about the genocide happening against the Uyghur minority Muslim population in China, Mr. Trudeau didn't show up for that vote. So I think we need to apply the appropriate pressure. The almighty dollar is not all that rules in our economy. There are tremendous trade opportunities with China, but we also have to make sure we balance those off of our commitment to our citizens, the Michaels, our commitments to rights, our commitments to the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. So I think a more serious approach, working with our allies, as you said, withdrawing from the Asian Infrastructure Bank, other actions of Beijing's influence around the world, we don't need to contribute to that. We need to stand up for our values alongside our allies. And in the process, I think, fight for our citizens and keep our public safety and intelligence secure.
Our next question comes from Keith in St. John. Keith, you are live with your question about the Canadian forces and what a Conservative government would do. You can go ahead now.
Yeah, hi, Erin O'Toole. It's Keith, and I was wondering, with our military, hasn't been properly funded, and with Russia and China sort of joining forces in war games and that, and I'm really not thinking that we should expect the United States to support us because I don't think they're a partner that you can really count on. So, what is your position on the military in Canada?
Well, thanks, Keith. As I said earlier, serving in the military was one of the most formative parts of my life. It kind of defines who I am. It deepened my love for the country. I got to serve in all parts of this country, including in Atlantic Canada. I also got to serve alongside some incredible men and women, and I think we have to do a number of things, including clean up the culture with respect to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. We owe it to women who step forward to serve their country to make sure that they can do that with respect and free of a culture of harassment and intimidation. I think that's critically important, and I'll make sure that's priority. We won't cover it up as Mr. Trudeau did for 3 years. We also have to do two key things, Keith. Give our men and women in uniform the equipment they need to do their job, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and we need to make sure that we take our Arctic sovereignty seriously. This is something I've been talking about really since I got to Parliament Hill, and it's something that we're not doing well enough. The only real investments in the last 40 years were all made by the previous Conservative government, and in the last number of years we've seen Russian military expansion in their part of the Arctic. We've seen China declare itself a near Arctic state. Check a globe. They're not part of the Arctic, yet they have an ambition there. We need to make sure that we have the ability, working alongside Inuit and Indigenous peoples and the Rangers, a great part of our Canadian Armed Forces, to have the capacity, the infrastructure for proper surveillance of the Arctic, both for our sovereignty and for the environment and wildlife. So investments in equipment and Arctic sovereignty will be key. And much like for the question earlier from Sean, veterans, my service in the military, I think is good for the Prime Minister to be able to understand the demands and what our expectations are on people that are serving on our behalf, and to make sure that within NATO, within NORAD, in these important relationships that Canada has, as a leading democracy in the world, that we take these questions seriously. Mr. Trudeau does not. In fact, at the last NATO meetings, Mr. Trudeau made news for mocking another leader on camera. We don't need more of the same with Mr. Trudeau. We need a serious Canada on the world stage again.
Wow. Thank you so much for those answers, Erin. Healthcare, childcare, the environment, the lobster fishery, housing affordability. Canada's Conservatives are ready to deliver with Canada's recovery plan and stand up for hardworking Canadians and their families. That's why I'm glad that you're leading Canada's Conservatives in this election. And folks, we hope that you found tonight's conversation with Erin O'Toole useful. If Erin O'Toole and Canada's Conservatives can count on your vote, please press 1. If you're supporting another party, please press 2. And if you're still unsure of how you're going to vote, please press 3. If you didn't have a chance to ask your question, please stay on the line. Leave us a message for our staff. Your question is important, and we'd like the chance to respond to you. Erin?
Well, thank you, Michael. You're becoming a pro at moderating these virtual teletown halls, and they're live on Facebook and YouTube. And we talked healthcare, we talked childcare. You're leading in the child department over me, too. How many do you have?
Amanda and I have 5 children.
Yeah. So we need to give families as much flexibility as possible. There's been a great number of questions from folks from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, PEI. Atlantic Canada is important. It's important to me. As I said, living and serving there, being educated there, I want to make sure that Atlantic Canada has a voice. And we have amazing candidates stepping up for us across Atlantic Canada. We have an amazing plan that I invite Canadians to check out, Canada's Recovery Plan. And if I learned anything from the military, we talked about this, you need a plan for every mission. And Atlantic Canada deserves a real voice. And that is what you will get with the Conservative Party. We have a new leader. We have a new approach. We're tackling the issues and opportunities facing Canada in 2021. And our candidates know Canada's best days are ahead of us, but we need a plan and we need leadership. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks for giving us your questions. Check out our website. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you have any additional questions, please check out Canada's Recovery Plan or send us a note. We want to earn your trust. So thank you for joining our virtual town hall tonight. Be well, and we'll see you on the campaign trail.